The sound of Michelle's laughter drifted through the open patio doors, mingling with the hum of cicadas. It was a full, carefree laugh, the kind I hadn't heard in months. From my spot in the kitchen, I could see her leaning forward at the garden table, her fingers curled around a wine glass. She was animated, her eyes alive with a brightness that didn't feel familiar anymore. I didn't recognize the man sitting across from her. He wasn't one of our neighbors, that much I knew. He had a thick book open in front of him, gesturing wildly as he spoke, his voice just loud enough to punctuate Michelle's laughter. They were deep in conversation, their heads tilted closer together than necessary. "What's going on?" I asked, stepping out onto the patio, trying to keep my tone neutral. Michelle turned to me, startled. "Oh, Joshua. This is Victor. He's a writer," she said, gesturing toward him with a casual wave. "You know, from the event I mentioned last week? He's helping me with some notes for the library fundraiser." Victor stood, extending a hand. "Nice to meet you," he said, his grip firm. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I nodded, shaking his hand while trying to make sense of the scene. Michelle wasn't one to bring strangers home, especially not late in the evening, with the kids already asleep. "It's getting late," I said, glancing pointedly at my watch. "Maybe we should wrap this up?" Michelle's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she plastered it back on. "We're just finishing up," she said lightly. "Victor was showing me some ideas for the fundraising campaign. He has some great insights." "Of course," Victor added, snapping his book shut. "I should get going anyway." "Thank you, Michelle." This was enlightening. As he walked out the gate, I watched Michelle wave him off, her fingers lingering in the air a second too long. The whole interaction sat like a weight in my chest, heavy and cold. "Who is this guy, really?" I asked once the gate swung shut. Michelle sighed, her smile now completely gone. "Joshua, don't start. He's just a writer. A professional. You know I'm trying to make this fundraiser work." "I'm not starting anything," I replied, holding up my hands. "It's just weird, that's all. I've never seen you so invested in a stranger's ideas." "Maybe because you're not paying attention," she snapped, and then stormed inside, leaving me alone on the patio. The thing was, I had been paying attention more than she realized. And something wasn't adding up. The morning after Victor's visit, I couldn't get the image of their interaction out of my head. It wasn't jealousy. I trusted Michelle, at least I thought I did, but there was something about her demeanor that felt different. She was always confident, but last night she seemed almost giddy, like a teenager with a secret she didn't want to share. I wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble seemed to be staring me in the face. Michelle left the house around 10 a.m., claiming she had errands to run for the fundraiser. "Don't wait up for lunch," she said as she kissed the kids goodbye and grabbed her tote bag. I watched her leave, noticing she'd worn that red sundress I hadn't seen in months. It wasn't exactly the kind of outfit for grocery shopping and picking up donation forms. I spent the morning trying to keep myself busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By noon, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to swing by the local coffee shop, the one Michelle frequented when she worked on her volunteer projects. Maybe she'd be there, and I could put this ridiculous nagging feeling to rest. When I arrived, the cafe was nearly empty, save for a couple of students buried in their laptops. No Michelle. No Victor. I ordered a coffee anyway and sat near the window, scanning the parking lot. Half an hour later, I was ready to leave, feeling foolish for even coming. But as I stepped out onto the sidewalk, I spotted her car. Not parked outside the cafe, though 2 blocks down, near the old bookstore. I walked over, pretending to browse as I peeked through the large display window. There she was, sitting at a small table in the corner. And across from her, like the universe was playing a cruel joke, was Victor. The way they were sitting told me everything I didn't want to know. Michelle leaned forward, her elbows on the table, hanging onto every word Victor said. He wasn't just talking, he was performing. His gestures were grand, his expression intense. Michelle's face mirrored his energy, her laughter erupting at intervals, drawing the attention of other patrons. They looked comfortable. Intimate. Too much so for two people who had just met a week ago. I felt my chest tighten as I debated whether to go in. But what would I even say? Confronting them now would make me look unhinged. Besides, I didn't have proof of anything inappropriate, just a gut feeling that screamed at me louder than any logical thought. So I walked away, heading back to my car with the taste of bile in my throat. At home, I sat in silence, staring at the kitchen table. The coffee I'd bought earlier had gone cold, untouched. My mind was racing. Why hadn't she mentioned she was meeting Victor again? If it was so innocent, why hide it? When Michelle returned that afternoon, she acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. She breezed into the kitchen, carrying a bag of groceries. "Hey," she said, flashing me that familiar smile. "The fundraiser is coming together. We're making progress." "Who's we?" I asked casually, keeping my tone neutral. "Oh, just the committee," she said, unloading vegetables onto the counter. "And Victor. He's been a huge help. He's got all these creative ideas for the auction. Is that why you were at the bookstore with him?" Michelle froze for a split second before recovering. "How do you know I was at the bookstore?" "I drove past," I lied. "Saw your car. Just thought it was weird you didn't mention it." Her face hardened, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features. "Why does it matter where I was?" "We were brainstorming. That's all." "It doesn't matter," I replied quickly, trying to diffuse the tension. "Just curious." She didn't say anything else, just went back to putting away groceries. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Michelle turned away from me, her breathing steady, as if she didn't have a care in the world. Meanwhile, I felt like my reality was crumbling. The next few days, I paid closer attention to her. Subtle things started to stand out. She'd get texts late at night and angle her phone away when I walked by. She laughed more when she thought I wasn't listening, little bursts of joy that seemed to come from nowhere. And then there were the lies. She'd say she was going to the gym, but when I checked, her car wasn't in the parking lot. She'd claim she was meeting a friend, but the timelines didn't add up. The worst part was that she didn't even seem to care about covering her tracks. It was as if she thought I was too blind, or too stupid, to notice. One evening, I decided to test her. She said she was going out for a committee meeting, so I casually offered to tag along. "It might be fun to help out," I said, keeping my tone light. Michelle looked genuinely startled. "Oh, you don't have to do that. It's just boring logistics stuff." "I don't mind," I pressed. She hesitated, her smile faltering. "Joshua, it's really not your thing. Besides, I'll be home late. You should just relax." I let it go, pretending to drop the subject. But as soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her. She didn't go to a committee meeting. Her car led me to a quiet park on the outskirts of town. I parked a safe distance away and watched as she got out, carrying a picnic basket. My heart pounded as I saw Victor emerge from the shadows, his arms wide as he greeted her. They hugged, not the polite kind of hug you'd give a friend, but the lingering, intimate kind. He took the basket from her, and they disappeared down a trail. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My stomach churned as I fought the urge to run after them, to demand answers. But I didn't. I stayed in my car, paralyzed by a mix of anger, fear, and something I couldn't quite name. That night, when Michelle came home, she was glowing, her cheeks flushed as if she'd just stepped out of a romantic movie. "How was the meeting?" I asked, my voice steady. "Productive," she said, not missing a beat. It was the ease with which she lied that crushed me the most. I didn't confront her that night. I needed more. More than just a gut feeling or circumstantial evidence. I needed proof. And I was going to get it, no matter how much it hurt. I didn't sleep much after that night at the park. It wasn't just the image of them together that kept me awake, it was the realization that Michelle was living a life I wasn't part of. I had questions, and I wasn't going to rest until I had answers. But confronting her wasn't as simple as barging in with accusations. I knew how she operated. Michelle was sharp, quick with her words, and good at twisting a situation to her advantage. If I came at her without undeniable proof, she'd turn it around on me, make me the bad guy for doubting her. So I planned. The next few days were excruciating. Michelle acted as if everything was normal, maybe even better than normal. She was suddenly more attentive, asking about my day, laughing at my jokes, and even initiating conversations at dinner. It was almost convincing, almost. Meanwhile, I worked behind the scenes. I started paying close attention to her routines, her comings and goings. I wasn't proud of it, but I installed a GPS tracker on her car. I needed to know where she was really going during those meetings and errands. By the end of the week, I had my evidence. Michelle wasn't just meeting Victor for coffee or brainstorming sessions. They were spending hours together in places that had nothing to do with the fundraiser, parks, secluded cafes, and once, a motel on the edge of town. The motel was the last straw. I didn't confront her right away. I needed to time it perfectly, to catch her off guard. So I waited until Saturday, when the kids were at a friend's house for a sleepover. That evening, Michelle was getting ready for another fundraiser meeting. She seemed almost eager to leave, humming to herself as she fixed her hair in the bathroom mirror. "You're in a good mood," I said, leaning against the doorframe. She glanced at me, her smile tight. "It's just nice to be making progress on something I'm passionate about." "Must be a hell of a fundraiser," I said, my tone flat. Michelle paused, her hands stilling in her hair. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I replied, pushing off the doorframe. "Just seems like you've been spending a lot of time on it, that's all." She turned to face me, her expression wary. "It's important to me, Joshua. I thought you'd understand that." "Oh, I understand," I said, my voice sharper now. "I understand that you've been spending a lot of time with Victor. More time than you've spent with me lately." Michelle's face hardened. "Are you seriously doing this right now? What, you're jealous because I'm working with someone who actually appreciates my ideas?" "This isn't about jealousy," I snapped. "This is about honesty. About respect. Do you have any idea how it feels to watch you lie to my face over and over again?" She crossed her arms, her stance defensive. "I haven't lied to you." "Really?" I asked, pulling my phone from my pocket. "So you weren't at a motel with him 2 days ago? You weren't meeting him in that park last week?" The color drained from her face. "You've been following me?" "I had to," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "Because you wouldn't tell me the truth. So I found it myself." Michelle stared at me, her eyes wide. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, spin some story to cover her tracks. But then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. "It's not what you think," she said finally. "Then explain it to me," I demanded. "Explain how meeting him in secret isn't what I think. Explain how sneaking off to a motel isn't what I think." "It's complicated," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Try me," I said, crossing my arms. Michelle hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, she sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Victor and we reconnected a few weeks ago," she began. "He's someone I knew a long time ago, before you and I got together. Seeing him again brought back a lot of feelings I didn't expect." "So you decided to cheat on me?" I asked bluntly. "It wasn't like that," she said quickly. "It started out innocent. We were just talking, catching up. But then, things got complicated. I didn't mean for it to happen, Joshua. I didn't plan this." "You didn't plan it, but you let it happen," I said, my voice rising. "You lied to me, to our kids, so you could relive some fantasy with your old flame. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. She wasn't the victim here. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But it's over now. I ended it. Did you? I asked, my voice cold. Or did he end it? Because it doesn't seem like you were planning to tell me the truth anytime soon. Michelle didn't answer. That's what I thought, I said, stepping back. I hope it was worth it, Michelle. I hope he was worth destroying everything we built together. Joshua, please, she said, standing and reaching for me. Don't do this. Don't throw everything away over a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, my voice incredulous. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. This was a choice. A deliberate choice to betray me and this family. For the first time, her defiance wavered. She sank back onto the bed, her head in her hands. What happens now? She asked, her voice muffled. That's up to you, I said. But don't think for a second that this just goes away. You don't get to brush this under the rug and pretend it never happened. She looked up at me, her face pale. What do you want me to do? I want you to leave, I said, my voice steady. At least for now. I need space. I need time to figure out if this is even worth salvaging. Michelle nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered again. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The silence between us was palpable after that confrontation. Michelle left the house that evening, suitcase in hand, her head hung low. She said she'd stay with a friend for a while, giving me space. I didn't argue or ask which friend it was, I didn't care. For the first time in our marriage, I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't relief, exactly, but the absence of the emotional storm that had been raging inside me for days. Maybe it was the clarity that came with accepting the truth, our marriage was over. I decided right then and there that I wasn't going to let her betrayal consume me anymore. If Michelle had made her choice, I'd make mine. But I wouldn't lash out. I wouldn't scream or cry or demand apologies that didn't matter. Instead, I would take a different approach, one she wouldn't see coming. The next morning, I got up early and made breakfast for the kids. I smiled, asked about their plans for the day, and pretended everything was normal. If they sensed anything was wrong, they didn't mention it. Michelle had always been better at hiding her emotions, but now it was my turn to master the art of indifference. When Michelle returned a few days later to pick up some things, I barely acknowledged her. Hi, she said hesitantly, standing in the doorway. Hey, I replied casually, not even looking up from my laptop. She lingered, as if waiting for me to say more, but I didn't. She eventually went upstairs, collected her clothes, and left without another word. The truth was, I wanted her to feel this emptiness. Not the searing anger or the gut-wrenching pain I'd felt when I discovered her betrayal, no, I wanted her to feel something colder, something that crept under the skin and stayed there. Over the next week, I focused on myself. I hit the gym after work, something I hadn't done consistently in years. I spent more time with the kids, took them to the park, helped with their homework. But beneath the surface, I was working on something else, my revenge. It wasn't just about hurting Michelle. It was about making her understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of betrayal. I wasn't naive enough to think it would fix anything, but it wasn't about fixing things anymore. It was about leveling the field. I started by reconnecting with old acquaintances, particularly women I hadn't spoken to in years. There was Rachel, a woman I'd briefly dated before Michelle came into my life. We'd parted on good terms and stayed friendly on social media. She'd always been warm and kind, and I knew she'd be open to meeting up. We started with coffee. Rachel listened as I vented about my failing marriage, her eyes full of sympathy. She didn't press for details, but she didn't need to, I could see the curiosity in her expression. Over time, those coffee dates turned into something more. A drink after work. A movie night at her place. She never asked about Michelle, and I never brought it up. At home, I maintained the facade of normalcy. Michelle and I interacted only when necessary, mostly about the kids. I avoided fights, avoided emotional outbursts, and avoided her altogether whenever I could. If she noticed the shift, she didn't say anything. Instead, she grew quieter, her usual confidence replaced by something more subdued. She'd linger in the kitchen after dinner, washing the same plate over and over as if she were waiting for me to say something. "Do you need anything?" she asked one evening, her voice tentative. "Nope," I said, barely glancing up from my phone. Her face flickered with something guilt, maybe? Frustration, but she didn't press further. That night, I went out to meet Rachel. The moment it happened, I felt an odd mix of satisfaction and emptiness. Rachel and I were lying in bed, the room dimly lit, and I couldn't help but think about Michelle. Not because I missed her, but because I wondered if this was how she felt when she was with Victor. Did she feel the same hollow justification, the same fleeting sense of power? Rachel didn't ask about my marriage that night. She didn't need to. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. When I got home, Michelle was still awake. She was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, staring blankly at the television. "You're back late," she said softly. "I had plans," I replied, my tone neutral. She didn't ask what kind of plans, and I didn't volunteer the information. Over the next few weeks, something changed. Michelle started trying harder, cooking my favorite meals, initiating conversations, even asking if I wanted to go out as a family. I indulged her at first, playing along to see how far she'd go. But I never let my guard down. I kept my emotional distance, showing just enough interest to keep her guessing. One evening, as we were sitting at the dinner table, she finally broke. "Joshua," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Can we talk?" "About what?" I asked, not looking up from my plate. "About us," she said, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I feel like you're different. Distant." "Maybe I am," I said simply. Her eyes welled with tears. "I know I hurt you. I know I messed up. But I need to know if there's still a chance for us." I set down my fork and met her gaze, my expression unreadable. "That's not up to me, Michelle. You're the one who broke us. You're the one who has to figure out if you can live with what you've done." She started to cry then, real, gut-wrenching sobs that I might have cared about once. But now, they felt like a performance. I stood up, grabbed my plate, and walked to the kitchen. "Let me know when you figure it out," I said over my shoulder. For the first time, I felt like I was in control. Weeks passed, and the house felt like a pressure cooker. Michelle kept trying to engage me, but I remained deliberately distant. It wasn't just a tactic anymore, it had become second nature. I wasn't cruel or dismissive, but I didn't offer her warmth either. I focused on the kids, my work, and, quietly, Rachel. Michelle noticed the shift. She wasn't blind. Her smile seemed forced, her attempts at conversation increasingly hesitant. When she tried to bridge the gap between us, I'd answer with polite but detached responses. The warmth we once shared had been replaced with a transactional coldness. The kids didn't seem to notice the tension, at least not directly. I went out of my way to keep things normal for them. We had family dinners, movie nights, and trips to the park. But the cracks in the facade were widening. One Friday evening, Michelle cornered me in the living room after the kids went to bed. "We need to talk," she said, her voice quiet but firm. I closed the book I'd been pretending to read and nodded. "Okay. Talk." She hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. I've noticed you've been pulling away from me. More than before." "Have I?" I said flatly, refusing to give her any satisfaction. "Yes, Joshua." "You have," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I can't fix this if you won't talk to me." "There's nothing to fix, Michelle," I replied. "You made your choices, and I've made mine." She blinked, caught off guard. "What does that mean?" "It means that whatever this was," I said, gesturing vaguely between us, "it's done. You broke it. I don't think there's a way back." Her face crumpled. "You're just going to give up? After everything we've built?" I laughed, a short, bitter sound. You mean after everything you destroyed? Michelle sat down across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I made a mistake. A horrible mistake. But it wasn't because I didn't love you. I was confused, I was caught up in something that shouldn't have happened, and I. Spare me, I cut in, my tone sharp. You didn't just make a mistake. You made a series of choices. You chose to meet him, to lie to me, to betray me. Over and over again. Don't insult me by pretending it was some accidental slip. She flinched at my words but didn't argue. I thought I could make this work, I continued. For the kids, if nothing else. But the truth is, I can't look at you the same way. I can't feel the same way. Joshua, please, she said, tears streaming down her face. I know I've hurt you, but I'm still here. I'm still trying. Doesn't that count for something? Not anymore, I said coldly. And don't act like you're some martyr for staying. You stayed because you didn't have anywhere else to go. Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't move to comfort her. I felt nothing. You're seeing someone, aren't you? She asked suddenly, her voice trembling. I didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch out between us. Finally, I said, does it matter? Yes, it matters, she said, her voice rising. You're my husband. Funny how that title means something to you now, I shot back. Where was that loyalty when you were sneaking around with Victor? She opened her mouth to respond but then closed it, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I didn't want it to come to this, she said quietly. Neither did I replied. But here we are. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the house. I told the kids I was going on a work trip, which wasn't entirely a lie. I'd lined up a few days of meetings out of town to clear my head. Rachel had offered her guest room, and I accepted, though we both knew it wasn't just for sleeping. When I returned a few days later, Michelle was waiting for me in the kitchen. We need to figure out what we're doing, she said, her voice weary. I thought that was obvious, I replied. We're done, Michelle. It's time to end this. Do the kids know? She asked, her voice breaking. Not yet, I said. But they will. We'll sit them down together and explain things as best we can. They deserve the truth. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. I don't want to fight you on this. I want us to handle it with as little damage as possible. Then don't fight me, I said simply. Over the next few weeks, we began the painful process of untangling our lives. We told the kids together, emphasizing that the split wasn't their fault. They took it as well as could be expected: tears, confusion, and a lot of questions. Michelle moved into an apartment a few miles away, and we agreed on a shared custody arrangement. It was civil, almost coldly so. The last time Michelle and I sat down together as a couple was in the lawyer's office, signing the final divorce papers. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the weight of everything had aged her overnight. When the papers were signed, she turned to me and said, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope one day you'll understand. I don't need to understand, I replied. I just need to move on. And with that, it was over. Divorce papers signed and lives officially untangled, Michelle moved out of our home the following week. The house was quieter now, and though the kids still spent half their time with me, it felt emptier. Yet, for the first time in months, the silence didn't weigh on me. It felt like freedom, something I hadn't experienced in years, though I didn't fully realize it until now. I wasn't naive enough to think that freedom meant happiness, at least not immediately. What it meant was clarity. I had spent so long wrapped up in anger, betrayal, and plotting my own revenge that I'd lost sight of the man I used to be. Now, with the marriage officially behind me, I had no excuses left. It was time to face myself. My first priority was the kids. I didn't want them to feel like they were collateral damage in all of this. I stuck to the shared custody schedule rigidly, picking them up every Wednesday and alternating weekends. On the days they were with me, I made sure they felt my full attention. Whether it was helping with homework, cooking their favorite meals, or playing board games, I poured myself into being the kind of father they deserved. The hardest part was the questions. Sarah, my eldest, was old enough to understand the broad strokes of what had happened. She asked once, quietly, if Mom had done something wrong. I hesitated before answering. She made choices that hurt our family, I said carefully. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you and your brother. None of this is your fault. It felt like the right thing to say, even if it didn't make me feel any better. Daniel, my youngest, didn't ask as many questions. He seemed more interested in whether we'd still have pizza night on Fridays and if Bailey the dog would go back and forth between houses. I envied his simplicity, but I also worried that he wasn't processing things fully. Meanwhile, Michelle was doing her own version of rebuilding. When we exchanged the kids at the halfway point each week, she'd make small talk about their activities, their schoolwork, or Bailey's latest antics. At first, I kept my answers short, not out of spite but because I didn't see the point in pretending we were friends. But as the weeks turned into months, I found myself letting my guard down slightly. Not for her sake, but for the kids. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat down with a beer and opened a box of old photos. I hadn't looked at them in years, not since Michelle and I had stuffed them into the back of the closet during a spring cleaning spree. There we were, young, carefree, grinning like idiots at our wedding. There were pictures of us on vacations, family outings, even just lounging on the couch in our first apartment. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, not for the woman Michelle had become, but for the life we'd once had. I couldn't hate her completely, no matter how much she'd hurt me. We'd built a life together, raised two amazing kids, and shared moments that were real, even if they were now overshadowed by everything that had gone wrong. But those photos also reminded me of something important. I wasn't the same person I was back then. And that was okay. Life after the divorce didn't feel like an ending. If anything, it felt more like a pause. For months, we were civil, polite, and distant, interacting only when necessary, mainly for the sake of Sarah and Daniel. Then something unexpected happened. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic moment. It was small, almost unnoticeable at first. It started with a phone call. "Joshua," Michelle said one evening, her voice hesitant, "I was wondering if we could talk sometime." Not about the kids, about us. I almost hung up. After everything we'd been through, the thought of revisiting the wreckage of our marriage felt like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. But something in her tone stopped me. It wasn't just guilt or desperation, it was something deeper. "Fine," I said after a pause. "But only because I think we need some closure." We agreed to meet at a park near her apartment, a place that felt neutral and safe. When I arrived, Michelle was already there, sitting on a bench under the shade of an oak tree. She looked nervous, like someone preparing for a job interview. "Thanks for coming," she said as I sat down. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began. "About us, about everything that happened. And I realized I never really told you, why." "I don't need excuses," I said bluntly. "It's not an excuse," she replied quickly. "It's an explanation. Not for you to forgive me, but for you to understand. You deserve that much." I crossed my arms and leaned back, gesturing for her to continue. "I didn't cheat because I stopped loving you," she said, her voice trembling. "I cheated because I stopped loving myself. I felt like I was losing who I was, just a wife, just a mom. And when Victor came along, he made me feel like I was still someone." Her words stung, but they also made sense in a way I hadn't expected. It didn't excuse what she did, but it painted a picture of the cracks in our relationship that I'd been too blind to see. "I know it's my fault," she continued. "I should have talked to you instead of running to someone else. I should have fought for us instead of giving in to something so meaningless." There was a long silence between us. For the first time in months, I felt something other than anger. "What do you want from me, Michelle?" I asked finally. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't expect you to take me back. I miss us. I miss our family. And I'd do anything to fix what I broke." Her honesty caught me off guard. I had prepared for defensiveness, for excuses, even for manipulation. But not this. I need time to think, I said, standing up. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Take all the time you need. I'll wait. Over the next few weeks, her words haunted me. Could I ever trust her again? Could we ever go back to what we had before? Or was that version of us gone forever? I thought about the kids, about the life we'd built together. 16 years wasn't something you could just erase. And despite everything, I still cared about her more than I wanted to admit. One evening, as I was tucking Daniel into bed, he looked up at me and asked, "Dad, do you think you and Mom will ever be friends again?" His question lingered in my mind long after he fell asleep. Maybe being friends wasn't enough. Maybe, for the sake of our family, we needed to try harder. The next day, I called Michelle. "Let's meet again," I said. We started slow. Coffee dates turned into longer conversations. We talked about the good times, the bad times, and everything in between. For the first time in years, we were honest with each other, not just about the affair, but about the cracks in our marriage that had led us to that point. Michelle apologized more times than I could count, but she didn't just say the words. She showed it in her actions. She went to therapy, both on her own and later with me. She worked on herself in a way I'd never seen before. I wasn't passive either. I realized that I'd been distant for years, burying myself in work and leaving her to handle the emotional weight of our family. I had my own share of guilt, and I owned up to it. It wasn't easy. There were arguments, setbacks, and moments when I wondered if we were just delaying the inevitable. But every time I looked at Sarah and Daniel, I reminded myself why we were trying. One night, months into our reconciliation, Michelle invited me over for dinner. The kids were staying with friends, so it was just the two of us. As we sat across from each other, sharing a bottle of wine, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For giving me another chance. For not giving up on us." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. She wasn't perfect, but neither was I. "Don't make me regret it," I said, half smiling. "I won't," she promised. We decided to move back in together, but only after months of rebuilding trust. It wasn't a decision we took lightly, and we made a pact: no more lies, no more taking each other for granted. The first few weeks were awkward, like learning to live with a stranger. But slowly, the walls between us came down. We laughed again. We argued less. And, eventually, we rediscovered the intimacy we thought we'd lost. The kids noticed the difference. Sarah even joked one evening, "You guys are acting like newlyweds." It's weird. We weren't perfect, and we never would be. But we were trying, and that was enough. One night, as we lay in bed, Michelle turned to me and said, "I don't deserve you, you know." I shook my head. We don't deserve each other. But that's the point. We're not perfect, but we're worth fighting for. She smiled, tears in her eyes. I'll never stop fighting for us. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed her.